The little bird sang the first half of the tune at dusk on the last cold evening of October, the way he had sung it every dusk for 3 winters. 6 notes rising and 4 notes turning, and then the small climbing phrase that wanted an answer. And then he stopped. Exactly there. Exactly where a living hand had once stopped him to teach him the rest. And he cocked his blunt dark head at the bars of his cage toward the shut and blackened end of the house and waited, with his whole small round body gone still, for the answering strain that was never once, in 3 winters of dusks, going to come. He was a bullfinch, a stout little cockbird with a breast the dull rose of a winter sunset and a cap of soot black, one of the piping bullfinches that the patient men of that trade will sit before week upon week with a little pipe until the creature has a whole air by heart and will give it back to you note for note, as sweet as any flute. And this one had been taught by a lady now 3 winters dead, the first strain of an old air, and no more, because she had died in the very week she meant to teach him the second, and so he had half a song in him and no ending to it, and he sang his half every evening as the light failed and stopped where the teaching had stopped and turned his head and waited. And the sound of that lovely rising half-phrase left hanging in the cold air with nothing to close it was a thing the servants of that house had learned over 3 winters not to be in the room to hear. An old man stood by the cage in the failing light and heard the half-tune stop, as he had heard it stop 1,000 evenings. And he did not try the answer, for he had tried it once in the first winter, and got it wrong, and the little bird had turned his back and would not sing for a month. Behind him the long gallery of Wintercombe ran away into the dark, hung with the dim faces of dead Wintercombes, and at the far end of it a door stood locked upon a wing that no one entered, where the smell of old smoke had never quite gone out of the plaster in 3 years. And beyond that the great grey house sat up on the shoulder of the down against a sky going out green and gold in the west, with the first frost already whitening the box hedges below, and every window along the front of it was dark but 2. 6 weeks from that October dusk, the Duke of Wintercombe would stand up in front of the whole of his county in the candlelight of Christmas Eve and finish that broken tune aloud in his own voice, and say into the hush the name of his dead wife that he had not been able to make his mouth shape in 3 years. And the little bird would sing the whole air through, at last, first strain, and answer, the way it had been meant to be sung, and there would not be one dry eye from the great hall to the servants crowded at the screen. But on the last cold evening of October, the Duke was a shut wing and a silent house, and a man who had not sat down to an instrument nor suffered a note of music under his roof in 3 winters. And the woman who was going to open him had not yet come up the long white road out of the vale. Her name was Marian Ashe, and she was 24 years old, and she was, that same evening, some 9 miles off and climbing, sitting up on the box of a carrier's cart with a small worn leather music satchel held flat on her knees under her hands, and a thin gray cloak drawn close against a cold that came up off the chalk and got into the bones and stayed there, and she did not yet know the name of the tune she was going to spend the best of her life learning to finish. She had been, until the summer just gone, the daughter of a country music master, the late Mr. Josiah Ashe, who had kept the little organ of a poor down country church and taught the psalmody to the school and tuned the few pianofortes of the neighborhood and trained such singing birds as the farmers' wives brought him, for a few shillings in the long winters, and who had raised his motherless girl inside music the way another man raises his child inside a trade, so that she had known the names of the notes before the letters and could pitch a true middle sound out of the silent air before she could well read, and had sat at her father's knee through 100 winter evenings learning the one thing he believed above every article of the faith he played the people into church to hear, which was that music was not an ornament of a life, but the very running of it made audible, and that a grief which is sung is a grief that is carried, and a grief which is forbidden its song is a grief that goes bad in the dark and comes out sideways, in a silence, in a locked door, in a bird that will only sing you half of what it knows. He had shown her more than once a thing she had thought at first a country marvel and understood at last to be only patience, which was how you bring a grieving songbird back to its voice, a bird gone silent and sullen in its cage after the loss of the only hand it had ever loved, not by coaxing and not by starving, but by sitting near it, evening on evening, asking it nothing, being dull and warm and safe and near, and giving it, very low and very true, the first notes of what it used to love, and waiting, and letting the small broken thing come back to the song of its own accord, in its own hour, because you cannot fetch a creature back out of its grief by wanting it. You can only make a place where the wanting is safe to come back to. Marion Ashe had brought more than one such bird back to song at her father's side before she was 15 years old, and had thought nothing of it, the way a smith's child thinks nothing of iron, and did not know, sitting on the carrier's cart in the October cold, that it was the only skill she owned in all the world that was worth a duke's ransom, and that she was carrying it, unknowing, straight up the white chalk road to the one house on the earth that was dying for the want of it. Her father had died in the last week of June, of a slow trouble of the chest he had never named to her, and had gone on tuning other men's instruments through until the week he could not lift his own hands to the keys, and Marion had nursed him and buried him and found, when the small reckoning was made, that a music master in a poor parish spends what little he has on the poor parish and dies, leaving his daughter his good ear, his book of airs, his tuning hammer, and a great deal less than nothing. The organ was the church's. The cottage went with the post to the next man, and Marion sold what could be sold, the few books and the tall clock and her mother's little seed pearl pin, and paid the small debts down to the last of them, and at the end of it she had a little under £4, a change of linen, a grey cloak, her father's book of airs, his tuning hammer wrapped in a stocking, and no living soul nearer to her than an aunt by marriage, who wrote her a very Christian letter about the largeness of God's providence. It was the cathedral organist, a stout, kind, gouty old man who had known and valued her father these 30 years, who found her the place, and he was honest with her about it as he wrote it out. There was a great house, he said, up on the high chalk in the north of the county, the seat of the Duke of Wintercombe, a house that had been, in the late Duchess's time, one of the most musical in 3 counties, and was now, since a great grief some 3 winters back, shut and dark and silent as a rung-out bell. And the Duke, who could not be got to concern himself with anything, had been prevailed on by his man of business to have the late Duchess's music library, a very great and valuable collection, at last sorted and catalogued and boxed, and a person was wanted who understood music enough to do the work, a copyist, quiet and gentle bred and not a gossip, for a small wage and their keep through the winter. And he had thought of her before he had finished reading the letter, and she might have the place if she could bear a lonely cold house and the melancholy of handling a dead woman's music. She took it. She had £3 and a cloak and no other door in England standing open. And there was besides a thing in the offer that took hold of her past her need, the picture of a great collection of a dead musician's music sitting boxed and forbidden and silent in a shut-house. For she was her father's daughter to the marrow, and the thought of music locked up unsung was to her very nearly a physical pain. and she wrote and accepted before she had well slept on it, and on the last week of October went up out of the soft green vale, where she had lived her whole life, into a high, bare, cold country of white roads cut down through the chalk, and long shorn hills the color of a hare's back, and the carrier, a talker, with 9 slow miles to fill, gave her the whole of Wintercombe before ever she saw its chimneys. He told her the Duke was a young man yet, 34, and a widower, and had been a pleasant enough gentleman once, keen on his music and his horses, before it happened, and now went about his own great house like a man moving through a sick room, quiet, shut, saying next to nothing. He told her there had been a Duchess, a young one, and a great beauty, and musical, musical past anything. You could hear the house of a summer evening a field off. And then he did the thing Marian was to watch a great many people do in the weeks that came. He stopped and clicked his tongue at the horse and said only, and there was a fire, miss, one bad winter, and left it there. A whole tragedy folded into 4 words and put away, and would say no more, but talked instead of the state of the roads. And Marian Ashey learned the first law of Wintercombe from a man who had never once been inside its gates, which was that there had been a fire and a Duchess, and that neither was to be spoken of aloud. All the last miles it was the same. At the turnpike and the smithy and the low thatched inn, the great house named, and the sentence built carefully around the middle of the thing, and the middle stepped over so smoothly that you saw the whole neighborhood had been doing it 3 winters and stopped noticing they did it. Before the trouble and since the trouble, and the poor young Duchess, God rest her. And then the eyes gone sideways and the voices dropped, so that by the time the cart came up the last long white rise in the last of the light, and Marian saw the house at last, she knew a great deal of the shape of the wound at Wintercombe, and not one plain fact of how it had been dealt. The house stood up on the shoulder of the down above her, very large and very old and beautifully built of a pale gray stone gone dark with the wet of that high country, with a long ordered front of tall windows, and a balustraded terrace falling away below it to gardens gone a little wild for want of a mistress, and behind and to the east of the main block a shorter wing set at an angle, and even at that distance and in that light Marian could see that the wing was wrong, that its long windows were black and blind and some of them boarded, and that the pale stone of it was, along the top, licked and stained with a great fan of old soot that no rain of 3 winters had washed away, and she understood, without being told, that she was looking at the fire, and that the great silent house had turned all its dark windows to the west like a face turned away, and that she had come, a music master's penniless daughter with a tuning hammer wrapped in a stocking, to a house where the music had burned. The cart set her down at a side door under a stone arch as the last green went out of the sky, and rattled away down the hill, and she stood with her satchel and her small corded box at her feet in a cold that made the inside of her nose ache, and nobody came for a long quarter of an hour, and she spent it the way her father had taught her to spend the first quarter of an hour in any strange place, standing very still and listening, because a house, he had told her, will tell you what it is before any person in it will, if you will only hold your tongue and let it. And Wintercombe, in the frost, in the near dark, told her that it was a house holding its breath. It was silent, in a way a country house is never silent. No scale being practiced behind a door, no fiddle in the servants' hall, no whistling in the yard, a maid's silence, a silence kept, and then out of it, from somewhere above and to the east, from up under the black windows of the burnt wing, there came a small thread of sound that stopped her heart and set it going again wrong. 6 notes rising and 4 notes turning, and a little climbing phrase that reached up and wanted an answer and then broke off, sharp, on the very step of the answer, and did not go on. And Marian Ashe stood in the frozen arch and knew that sound for exactly what it was, for she had heard it like a dozen times over a bird cage in her father's cottage, the half-song of a bird that has lost the one who taught it, and sings the fragment it has, and stops where the teaching stopped, and waits. And the hair stood up on her arms, not with fear but with a terrible recognition, and something in her that had sat at her father's knee learning the medicine for exactly this sickness turned over and woke. And she thought, before she had met one living soul in that house, somebody has got to answer that poor creature. When a woman came out at last with a horn lantern, it was the housekeeper, a tall, spare, upright person of 60 or more, named Mrs. Gaunt, with a face like the back of a spade and a great ring of keys at her waist, and she held the lantern up to Marian's face and looked at her, and looked down at the small box and said, "Well, there is not much of you," in a flat voice that settled the whole question of Marian Ashe for the household before Marian had got out 3 words. The box went up a cold back stair to a small room at the north end where, she found by morning, the water in the ewer wore a lid of ice, and the one narrow window looked out straight across a leaded valley of roof at the black boarded windows of the burnt wing, not 30 feet off, so that the last thing she was given to look at each night and the first each morning was the very wound of the house. And going up the stairs, Mrs. Gaunt gave out the rules of the place in the level, unarguing voice of a woman reading a bill she does not expect to be questioned on. She was to keep to the music library and the passage to it and no further into the family side. She was to catalog and copy and pack what she was set, and not to play upon any instrument in the house, not one note, for His Grace would not have music, and that was the beginning and the end of it. She was not to go into the east wing, which was shut and unsafe, nor try any locked door, and there were a good many. She was not to trouble the old man Peck who kept the birds. She was not to speak of the late Duchess, nor ask any question of her, to servant or soul in the village. And if she valued her place, she was not to speak of the fire at all, ever, to anybody. And on the half landing, with her thin hand flat on the cold newel, Mrs. Gaunt stopped and said the last of it in a lower voice, worn smooth as a step by long use. "In this house we do not speak of her grace, and we do not make music, and if you cannot bide by those 2 things, you had best go down again in the morning." And Marian waited for the rest of it, for the name, for the how and the when, and there was no rest of it. And Mrs. Gaunt lifted her lantern and went on up the stairs. That first night Marian lay in the narrow cold bed under every covering she had, with her father's book of airs on the chair, where she could put her hand on it in the dark, and listened, and heard twice more, before she slept that same 6 notes rising and 4 turning, and the little phrase that climbed and reached and broke off unanswered, and each time it came she found her own throat had tightened and her own lips had shaped, without her willing it, the notes that ought to have followed, the falling answering strain that any musician's ear could hear the want of as plainly as you hear the want of a step at the top of a dark stair. And each time she made herself lie still and not sing it, because she did not yet know the tune, and might get it wrong and do harm, and because she had been 3 hours in the house and knew only that it was sick. Sick in a way she recognized the way a physician's child recognizes a cough, and that its sickness and the one gift she owned in all the world were, by some turn of Providence, the very lock and the very key. She did not sleep much, and toward morning, over the wind moaning in the boarded windows across the leaded valley, she heard the little bird give his half-song again in the black hour before light, when no creature but a grieving one is awake to sing, and she made up her mind, lying there in the cold with her hand on her dead father's book, that whatever else she did or did not do at Wintercombe, however long her place lasted, she was going to find out the second half of that tune and give it to that bird. Because it was the one plainly useful thing she knew how to do in all the world. And because a grief you will not let sing does not lie quiet where you shut it, it goes and lives in something smaller and more helpless. And she had come to a house where it had gone and lived in a bird. She learned the shape of Wintercombe the way the dust learns a house, from underneath and by the cold, and everywhere she went in it in those first days she found the grief laid out through the rooms like a table set and waiting for a guest who was never coming. The music library, where she was to work, was a long, handsome room lined to the ceiling with presses and shelves of bound music, thousands of pieces, a lifetime's loving gathering, songs and sonatas and whole operas copied out in a fine sloping hand she soon knew for the dead Duchess's own, and every instrument in it stood shrouded. The little spinet under a holland cloth, a gilt harp in the corner swathed like a body laid out, and on a stand by the covered spinet, exactly where a hand had left it, an open book of manuscript music gone gray with 3 years' dust. The last thing the Duchess had been writing, and Marian did not touch it for a long time, only looked, the way you do not straighten the pen on a dead man's desk. She found, going quietly where she was let, and once or twice a step where she was not, the same thing over and over, a grief that had been forbidden to move and so had set, like a joint left unused, into the very furniture of the house. She found in a small saloon a great pianoforte, a very fine one, shut and locked, and the key not on Mrs. Gaunt's ring nor on any ring, and was told, when she asked as innocently as she could, only that His Grace kept that key himself, and it was not to be spoken of. She found the Duchess's own sitting room shut up and the shutters barred, a pair of little garden gloves still curled on the sill, where 3 summers of sun had faded them, cleaned round but never cleaned away. Because to put away a dead woman's gloves was a thing nobody in that house had been given leave to do. She found the choir gallery in the chapel with its music desks still standing and the last anthem still open on the central desk. The whole apparatus of a house that had sung together every week of its life stopped dead in the middle of a bar and left, dusty and reproachful, in the cold. And she found the burnt wing, or the near edge of it, the locked door at the end of the long gallery beyond which nobody went, and standing outside that door on a marble side table, a branch of candlesticks and a tinder box and a folded shawl laid ready, 3 winters ready, as if their owner might at any moment come along the gallery in the dark and want a light and a wrap to go in and play. And it was there, outside that locked door, on her 4th day, that she first came on the birds. There were several cages along that cold end of the gallery, canaries and a linnet and a pair of doves, all of them the dead Duchess's, kept on and fed, because to have let a dead woman's pets die would have been a cruelty nobody could quite bring themselves to. But at the very end, on a bracket by the locked door, in a tall old cage of turned wood and wire kept cleaner than any of the rest, sat the bullfinch, the rose-breasted cockbird with his soot-black cap, and Marian stood in front of his cage and looked at him, and he looked back out of one small, bright black eye, sidelong, judging, and did not sing. And she did not sing to him, not then. She only stood and let him look. And after a while she saw the thing she had come up 9 miles of cold road, half knowing she would see, which was that his cage was set so that when he faced the bars he faced the locked door of the burnt wing, and that he had worn the perch bare and pale on that one side with sitting there, turned toward the door, waiting, 3 winters, for a hand to come out of it that was in the churchyard under the yews. It was there by the cages that she first saw old Ambrose Peck, who came shuffling along the gallery in list slippers with a covered pot of seed and a little can of water. A small, stooped ancient man of near 70, with a soft, ruined face and pale eyes and 2 great tufts of white hair over ears that she learned in the first minute by the pitch at which she had to speak, heard very little of the world any more, and he stopped when he saw her, and a kind of fright went over his old face. For he had been told the same rules she had, to keep himself to himself and let be, and he made to shuffle past her with his eyes down. But Marian Ashe, who had spent her childhood among exactly such old men, the sextons and the ringers and the broken-down waits of a poor parish, did the one thing that would reach him, which was to put out her hand and touch his sleeve to stop him, and then, when he looked up startled, to hum to him, loud and clear and pitched high where the deaf still hear, the first strain of the bullfinch's tune, the 6 rising and the 4 turning, and the little climb which she had by heart now from 3 nights of listening, and to stop, as the bird stopped, on the very step of the answer, and look at the old man, and wait. And Ambrose Peck stood in the cold gallery, with the seed pot in his 2 hands and his mouth open and the tears standing all at once in his pale old eyes, because in 3 winters not one living soul in that house had known the tune well enough to so much as hum him the half of it. They had only shut their ears and hurried by. And here was a slip of a girl he had never seen humming him the very phrase note for note and stopping where it stopped. And he looked at her the way a man looks who has been alone with a thing a long time and has just heard another human voice say it aloud. And he said, in the too loud, oddly tuned voice of the very deaf, "You know it. You know her tune." And Marian, pitching her voice up to him, said, "I know the half of it, the half he sings. I do not know the end. Nobody has ever let me hear the end." And the old man Peck looked at her a long, long moment, and then set down his seed pot on the marble table beside the 3 years' ready candlesticks, and said, "Come away from here where the wind is, miss, and I will tell you a thing I have not been let tell in 3 winters, and God forgive me for holding my tongue on it as long as I have." He took her to his own small, warm, cluttered room off the stable court, the one warm room she had yet found in the whole of Wintercombe, hung about with bird cages and pipes and the little turning bird organ of his trade, and made her sit by his fire, and gave her the shape of it, not the worst of it, not that first day, only the shape. He had been, he told her, singing master and music copyist to the family the better part of 50 years, and it was he who had taught her Grace her first fingering on the spinet when she came to the house a bride of 19, a young lady out of a musical family in the West, delicate always, a little frail thing with a great voice in her past all reason, the way you will sometimes find the biggest voice in the smallest and weakest chest, and she had made Wintercombe in her 11 years into the singingest house in 3 counties, a house of Christmas evenings and summer concerts, and a chapel choir that people drove 20 miles to hear, and she and the young Duke had been, old Peck said, and his voice went unsteady on it, as happy a pair as ever he served, for the Duke had loved her music near as much as he loved her. And then, the last 2 winters of her life, the delicacy in her chest had turned to something worse, a decline, a consumption, the physician said, the thing that so often takes the sweetest voiced, and they had forbidden her more and more. The night air, the cold rooms, the exertion, and last of all the very singing itself. For the great London doctor had told the Duke plainly that every hour his wife spent singing in that cold high house was an hour bleeding out of the little life she had left, and that if he loved her, he would take the music from her and keep her warm and quiet and still, and buy himself a year or two more of her that way. And the Duke, old Peck said, looking into his fire, did the hardest thing ever he saw a man do out of love, which was the wrong thing, he believed the doctor, being half wild with the fear of losing her, and had the music room fires let go out, and the great pianoforte locked, and the key put in his own pocket. And he begged her, and then he ordered her to give over her singing and be still and be kept for his sake, that he might have her the longer. And she, who was dying and knew it a deal better than he did, and would rather have had one more winter of her music than 3 of sitting shawled and silent by a fire being kept alive like a plant in a pot, pleaded with him for her music room, and he would not, because he could not bear to help her spend the little life she had, and there were hard words between them at the last over it, the only hard words ever known to pass between that gentle pair. And there the matter stood, unmended. On the December night it happened. And in those same last weeks, old Peck said, half broken-hearted and shut out of the music she loved, her Grace had taken to teaching the bullfinch. She had had the little cockbird 2 years, and piped him small phrases for her amusement, and now in her forbidden idleness she set herself to teach him, note by patient note, a whole air, an old air she was fond of, a thing in 2 strains, a question and an answer, the first strain that climbs and asks, and the second that falls and answers and lays the question to rest. And she taught him the first strain, the asking half, over 3 weeks of afternoons, till he had it perfect, and she used to say, old Peck told her, and here his voice went right away to a whisper, she used to say, when he has the whole of it by heart, the question and the answer both, then I shall not mind so much about the rest, for there will be one voice in this house that goes on singing my music after the doctors have stopped mine. And she never taught him the answer. For on a bitter night in the middle of that December, when the whole house was abed, her Grace rose in the dark and lit herself a single candle and went, in her nightgown and a shawl, along the cold gallery, and unlocked with a key she had somehow got the door of the music room that had been forbidden her, because she could not sleep, because she was dying and forbidden the one thing that made her life a life, because she wanted, old Peck said, only to sit at her own instrument one more time in the quiet, and work out on the keys the falling answering strain she meant to teach her bird in the morning. And something in that cold-shut room went wrong in the dark, whether the candle or a coal she tried to light against the cold, or her own failing that made her fall. No man ever knew. And the music room took fire, and by the time the house was roused, the wing was a furnace, and they never reached her. And the Duke of Wintercombe stood in the freezing garden in his shirt and watched the room where his wife was burned against the December sky, and was held back by 4 men from going in. And in the morning the wing was a black shell open to the sky, and her Grace was gone. And on the music desk of the little spinet in the library which the fire never touched, there lay the sheet where she had begun, some afternoon that last week, to write out for her bird the answering strain, and had got down 4 bars of it, and no more. And there it lay yet, old Peck said, 4 bars, and a broken-off line, the last thing her living hand ever made, and not a creature had had the heart to finish it, or the cruelty to throw it away in 3 winters. And that, he said, is why the little bird sings the half and stops miss, for the half is all she ever gave him, and he is waiting on the answer she died, going down in the dark to fetch him. And there is not a man nor woman in this house that can give it him. And his Grace, that shut the music out of her to keep her, and lost her by it, has shut the music out of the whole house ever since, and himself along with it, and cannot hear a note but it is a knife in him, and cannot say her name, and cannot go into the wing, and cannot let that poor bird be answered, because to answer the bird is to finish the very tune she died going down to finish. And I have kept the bird alive 3 winters, and fed him, and I could not do it. For my ears are gone, and I get it wrong, and he turns his back, and there it has stood, and there it stands. And you are the first living Christian that has come up that road in 3 years, with the tune in your head and the wit to know what it means. She began that same week, and she began, as her father had taught her to begin with any grieving creature, by doing nothing at all for a long time. She did not sing to the bird. She only carried her work up when the short afternoons failed and the gallery was empty, and sat herself down on a hard chair a little way from his cage with a lapful of the Duchess's music to catalogue, near the one warm patch where a flue ran up inside the wall, and stayed there an hour, 2 hours, in the cold, saying nothing, wanting nothing, turning her pages and letting the little bird on his bracket by the locked door grow used to the sight and the smell and the breathing of a person who came near him at dusk and did not stare and did not tap the cage and did not ask him for so much as a note. The first evening he watched her the whole 2 hours, sidelong, suspicious. The second he forgot her long enough to preen. By the fourth he gave, at the failing of the light, his half-song, the 6 rising and 4 turning and the climb and the break, not to her, only into the air toward the locked door as he always did. And Marian sat with her pen stopped over her list and did not answer it, though every trained nerve in her ached too, because it was not yet time, and she did not yet have the answer sure. For she had, in those same days, gone quietly to the manuscript on the spinet's desk, the 4 bars in the dead woman's hand, and studied them until she had them, and then had sat over her father's book of airs of an evening in her cold room and hunted through it. For she knew the tune now. It was an old air her own father had played, and between the Duchess's 4 written bars and her father's book and her own good ear she had built up, note by careful note, the whole of the answering strain, the falling phrase that took the bird's climbing question and turned it and brought it home and laid it down, and she had it now entire, sure, in her own throat, the thing that had not been sung under that roof in 3 winters. And still she waited 3 more evenings, until the little bird had so far taken her for a piece of the safe, dull furniture of the dusk that he sang his half-half toward her too, cocking his head as if to ask did she of all the deaf world understand what he was about. And then, on the 8th evening, in the last of a gray light, when he had climbed his little phrase and broken off and turned his head to the door to wait, Marian Ashe, sitting still with her hands quiet in her lap and her eyes turned a little away from him so as not to fright him, opened her mouth and gave him, very low, scarce above a breath, in tune, in time, the answer. She sang the falling strain, the whole of it, the phrase that came down out of his climb and turned it and carried it home and set it gently down, and stopped, and the bird went rigid on his perch, every feather tight, his head snapped round to her, and for the space of 3 heartbeats there was a silence so complete she could hear the blood in her own ears, and she thought, I have got it wrong. I have done him a harm. And then the little rose-breasted cockbird threw up his blunt black head and sang the first strain again, the whole climbing question of it, clean and sure and urgent, sang it at her, and stopped, and looked, and waited, and Marian answered him again. The falling half, low and true, and he took it, and gave her the question a 3rd time, faster. And she gave him the answer. And there in the freezing gallery under the black boarded windows a girl and a bird sang between them. Question and answering phrase. The first whole music heard in the house of Wintercombe in 3 winters. So quietly that not a soul below stairs could have caught a note. And Marian Ashe sat with the tears running down her cold face in the dark where nobody could see them and cost her nothing, and sang a dead woman's ending back to a dead woman's bird. And the bird, for the first time in 3 winters, did not turn at the last to the locked door and wait. He had got his answer. He tucked his head and settled his feathers and slept. She went up every evening after that, at the hour nobody wanted her, and gave the bird his answer. And within a se'nnight, he would sing the whole air through himself, if she gave him only the first 2 notes to start him, the way his lost mistress had meant him to before she died going down to fetch it. And it was old Ambrose Peck who found them at it, on a wild wet evening at the end of the 2nd week, come shuffling up with his seed pot, and stopping dead in the dark of the gallery with the rain roaring on the leads, listening, his ruined ears just able, at that near distance and that pitch, to catch it, the little bird singing the whole tune out entire, and a girl's low voice under it, holding the time. And the old man set down his pot and put his sleeve up over his face and stood and wept without noise in the dark. And when at last Marian went to him, he took her 2 hands in his 2 old ones and said, in his loud, flat, deaf man's voice that he could not have softened if he tried, I taught her that tune. Miss, 50 years ago I taught her mother's tunes to her. And she has been 3 winters dead, and I have listened to that bird sing the half of one of them every dusk of it, and not been able to give him the rest. And you have done it in a fortnight. And I do not know, are you an angel or only a music master's girl, and it comes to the same thing. For there is no greater kindness in this world than to finish a thing the dead left off. And Marian said, It is not finished yet, Ambrose. There is the pianoforte locked, and the wing shut, and her Grace's own hand on that desk stopped at 4 bars. And the house dark, and his Grace that cannot say her name. The bird is the least of it. The bird is only where the grief went to hide because it was smallest. There is a great deal more of this house wants answering than 1 bird. And I do not know that it is mine to do, or that I shall be let. And the old man Peck looked at her a long time in the dark and said, No more did anybody know it was theirs to do. That is how a thing goes 3 winters undone, miss, because every soul in the house stands waiting to be given leave. And there is only ever the one, at the last, that does not wait. She met the Duke on a still black evening in the 3rd week of November, at the cage, in the last of the light. She had the bird singing his whole air softly through, sitting quiet and content on his perch for once instead of pressed to the bars toward the door, and she had let herself, for once, forget where she was, when she felt rather than heard that she was watched, and looked up, and there was a man standing at the turn of the gallery in the dark, tall, very tall, worn thin nearly to gauntness, in a plain black coat, with dark unquiet hair pushed back off a hard, handsome, unhappy face. And she knew him at once, though she had never once been near him, because for a month the whole house had arranged itself around the hole where he was, and here the hole was, wearing a coat, looking not at her at all but at the bird, at his dead wife's bullfinch sitting quiet and singing whole in the dusk, with an expression like a man who has opened a door he thought gave onto a shut room and found somebody he loved sitting in it in the sun. She should have risen and dropped her eyes and taken herself off, for that is what the copyist of a dead lady's music does when the master of the house comes on her unbidden in his own gallery after dark. But the bird was singing soft and settled at last after a fortnight's patient work, and she was not going to lurch up and stiffen him and send him back to the bars and the waiting for the sake of a curtsy, and so she stayed exactly as she was, still on her hard chair with her hands in her lap, and she said, "Lo," not turning her head, in the flat, plain voice her father had taught her to use with a creature that must not be startled. "Be still where you are, sir, if you please, and do not speak yet." And the Duke of Wintercombe, who had not been told to do or not do a single thing by any living soul since the December his wife died, who was managed by his whole household like a cracked and precious glass carried across a crowded room, who had not heard a plain, unfrightened human voice give him a plain order in 3 winters, stood still at the turn of the gallery in the dark, and did not speak. The bird sang his air through, once, twice, into the quiet, whole, and unhurried, and the tall man listened to it with his jaw set and his hands closed at his sides, the first music heard in his house since the fire, sung by a creature he had thought forever broken. And when at last the little bird tucked his head and went to sleep on his answered song, Marian rose and turned and made her curtsy and waited to be turned out of the house. He did not turn her out. He said, in a low voice with 3 winters of rust and disuse all over it so that she had to lean to catch it, the first words she ever heard him speak, they told me he would never sing the whole of it. And Marian said, "They were mistaken, sir. He wanted only the answer to his question, and nobody had it to give him, and now he has it, and he is content." And the Duke said, "And where did you come by the answer?" And Marian said, "Some of it was written on a desk in the library, in a hand I take to be her Grace's, 4 bars of it, and the rest I built from an old book of my father's, for it is an old air, and my father played it, and the rest again from my own ear, which is the one thing I was left that is worth anything, and I hope I have done no wrong in it. But I could not sit in a house and hear a creature ask the same question every dusk for want of an answer any musician living could supply, and not supply it." And the Duke of Wintercombe turned his head and looked full at her, a small, plain, gray-eyed young woman standing straight-backed in the cold, with no fear in her at all, and he said, very low, "My wife used to say that when he had the whole of it by heart, there would be one voice in this house that went on singing her music after hers was stopped. And he had not said the words my wife allowed to any human creature in 3 years. And she saw the saying of them go through him like a wound, and she had the great good sense to say nothing at all, and to let the silence be. And after a while the Duke said only, 'Good night,' and turned, and walked away up the dark gallery. And that was the first time. He came again. Not every dusk, but often at the hour she had the birds singing, and he would stand at the turn of the gallery with his hands pushed into his coat and listen. And sometimes he said nothing at all and after a while went away, and sometimes he asked her a plain question about the bird, or the tune, or a piece of the music she was cataloging, and she answered it plainly, as one musician to another, without deference and without pity, which were the 2 things his whole world had smothered him in 3 years, and piece by piece, over the cold weeks, the shut man began to talk. He told her the bird had been whelped the same spring his wife first sang in the county, and that the 2 of them, the small delicate lady and the small rose-breasted bird, had been half one creature about the music room those last 2 winters, she teaching and he learning, hour on hour, when the doctors had left her little else she was let do. He told her, another evening, and looked afterward, as if he wished he could pull the words back, that he had not once sat down to an instrument since, that he could not so much as pass the locked door of the saloon where the great pianoforte stood without his heart going wrong in him, and that the sound of any music at all, a fiddle in the village, a child's psalm on the wind from the school, was a thing he had come to dread the way another man dreads the sea. And Marian said, "My father used to say that a man who cannot bear music is only a man with a great deal of it dammed up in him and no channel cut, and the music is not his enemy, it is the flood behind the wall, and the wall is the enemy." And the Duke stood a long time in the dark and then said, "And how does a man cut the channel?" And she said, "He does not do it all at once, sir. He lets a little through." Of an evening, in the dark, where nobody is by to see, the way you have stood these 3 weeks and let a little bird sing to you. And the Duke of Wintercombe looked at her and said nothing, and did not go away for a long while. It came out of him at last on a night of hard sleet at the very end of November, not because she asked, for she never once asked, but because a weight held alone too long will shift of itself in the end, whether a man wills it or no. He had come to the library where she worked late by one candle, and he stood a while by the shrouded spinet, and then he took from his waistcoat pocket a small key on a black ribbon, worn bright with 3 years' handling, and looked at it in his palm, and said, without any preamble, "This is the key of the pianoforte." Marian said nothing, and went on folding a sheet of music small, and let him come to it in his own time, the way you let a frightened thing come to the door. He said, "I locked it in the November before she died, and I have carried it ever since, and I have not been able to open it, and I have not been able to lose it." And then, turning the little bright key over and over in his long fingers, the Duke of Wintercombe told her the thing he had not told a living soul in 3 winters. He told her his wife had been dying, slowly, of a decline of the chest, and that the great physician had told him to his face that her singing and playing were bleeding the life out of her by the hour, and that if he loved her he must take the music from her and keep her still and warm and quiet and buy himself 2 more years of her that way, and that he had believed him being half mad with the terror of losing her, and had let the music-room fires die, and locked this instrument and begged her, and at the last commanded her, to give over the one thing that was the whole running of her, that he might keep her the longer. He told her she had pleaded with him, his gentle wife who had never crossed him in 11 years, and had said a thing he had carried like a coal in his chest ever since, that she would rather have 1 more winter singing and be gone than 3 winters kept alive and silent like a bird with a cloth thrown over its cage, and that he had not yielded, because he could not bring himself to help her spend the little life he had left of her, and that they had parted that last night on hard words, the only hard words of their whole marriage. He told her how he had woken in the black middle of that December night to the smell of smoke and the house screaming, and had run up to a gallery full of fire, and had understood, in the one moment before the men laid hold of him, the whole of it, that she had risen in the dark and lit a single candle, and gone, with a key she had somehow got, along the cold gallery to the forbidden room, not to defy him, he knew her too well for that, but only to sit at her own instrument one last quiet hour and work out on the keys the falling answering strain she meant to teach her bird in the morning, so that when the doctors had stopped her voice there should be one small throat left in the house to sing her music after her, and that the cold shut room and the single candle and her own failing had done between them the very thing he had spent every waking hour trying to prevent. And she had died in the dark, alone, going down after the one thing he had taken from her, and the last true words that had passed between them living had been his refusing her the key that lay now bright and small in his hand. And the Duke said, in a voice gone right down to nothing, There is no way to say it, do you see? No way to stand up in the daylight and be the Duke of Wintercombe, and say aloud that my wife burned to death going in secret after the one thing I took from her to keep her safe. For every soul that heard it would understand in the same breath that my care killed her as sure as if I had carried the candle myself, and that the music this house made 200 years is the very thing my hand shut out of it the night she died, and so I have said nothing. 3 years, and shut the wing, and locked the pianoforte, and put the music out of the whole house and myself along with it, because I could not have the one small piece of it. Her bird singing the half she taught him, without the whole unbearable rest coming up behind, and I do not know how to stop, and I do not know how to go on. And Marian Ashe stood in the cold library with a dead woman's music in her hands and understood the whole of it, and she did not say it was not your fault, because it was in a manner his fault and he knew it far better than she did, and that had never been the thing. She said, after a long while, in the flat plain voice, my father buried a young wife of our parish, whose husband kept her from her own mother's deathbed, for fear the winter roads would give her a low fever. And she took the fever at home notwithstanding, and died that same month. And the man held to his grave that his keeping her had killed her. And my father told him the only thing he ever found to say to such a grief, that we are none of us given to know which road carries the fever, that a man does the loving, careful thing with the light he has, and the dark takes whom it takes regardless, and that to have loved somebody carefully and lost them anyway is a bitter portion, but it is not murder, and that to spend the rest of your own life shut and silent for the shame of having chosen wrong in the dark is only to let the same dark take a second life it had no claim on, and your grace did not lock that instrument to harm her. You locked it to keep her, and you were wrong, and being wrong out of love is the commonest and most human thing there is. And she knew it, and she went down in the dark, not to spite you, but to finish a tune for a bird, so that a piece of her should outlast her, which is the least murderous errand a soul ever went upon. And if you have any doubt at all what she would have you do with that key, you have only to go up the gallery and listen to what she spent her last strength teaching that bird to ask for. And the Duke of Wintercombe put his face in his hand in the sleet light of the library and wept, at last, 3 winters late, standing by his wife's shrouded instrument with her music all about him in cases. And Marian took up her candle very quietly and went out and left him to it. Because there are things a soul is owed, and the first of them is to grieve at last without a stranger by to watch. And she had given him the one thing she had, the plain truth in a plain voice, and it was his now to take up the key or lay it down. Lady Clarissa Vokes came to Wintercombe on the 2nd of December, with a maid and a man and a great many boxes, and a way of coming into a cold room that made the room straighten itself and take notice. She was 26, and she was, past any argument, beautiful, tall, and clear-skinned, with a great deal of dark hair and level gray eyes, and that carriage of the head that cannot be got after the age of 12. And Marian understood within a day that she was neither guest nor stranger nor chance caller, for she had her own rooms kept ready, and had had them these several years. For Lady Clarissa and the Duke of Wintercombe had been spoken of together since they were children, their 2 estates marching along the same 6 miles of down, and it had been understood on every side that the Duke, widowed, would in a year or 2 marry his old neighbor, as men of great estates so often marry the patient, beautiful woman who has waited near at hand. And she had waited through the dying and the fire and 3 winters of a man gone silent and gray and shut as the far side of the moon, and had earned, she felt, not altogether without justice, the thing surely at last coming to her, which was to be Duchess of Wintercombe, before she was too old to be glad of it. And she came down that December, on the very edge of her patience, and found a penniless orphan at a birdcage, telling the Duke to be still and not speak yet, and the Duke being still, found the dead Duchess's bird singing its whole air soft and content, found a little music heard again of an evening, low in the dark, found the shut man beginning ever so slightly to thaw, and understood, being neither fool nor blind, exactly what she looked at, and that it had come on the Duke without his knowing it, and the girl without her seeking it, and that neither had done one thing a court could name, and that this, the terrible innocence of it, was the thing there was no fighting. For a woman may fight a flirtation and win, and she cannot fight a plain girl who has given a grieving man back the sound of his dead wife's music and asked him for nothing. There is nothing anywhere in it to take hold of. She was not a monster, for the truth of her is a sadder and commoner thing. She was kind to Marian in small ways, had her name by heart in a day, was honestly glad the bird sang again, and seeing Marian's cuffs gone thin, sent up to her, without a word, a length of good dark stuff to be made against the cold, and she watched, all the while, with a sickness at her heart, the thing at the birdcage ripen in the long dark evenings. She came to Marian herself on the 9th of December in the library and shut the door and said her piece well, for she was not yet a cruel woman. There was a family in a cathedral town in the west, she said, a canon and his wife and 3 young daughters, wanting a gentlewoman that understood music, at £35 by the year and her own parlor with a fire in it, and she had written of Marian already in the warmest terms, and they would take her on that word, and she might go at the quarter and be settled by a warm fireside before the deep of the winter came down. £35 a year. Marian did the sum any woman in her place cannot help doing, and it was a great sum, more than 3 years' wage at Wintercombe. A parlor of her own, music let and welcome about her, the whole difference between a life and a long cold string of other people's freezing back stairs, and it was, she knew, also the kindest and most generous bribe she was ever likely to be offered. She said, "May I ask why your ladyship is so very good to me?" And Lady Clarissa, to her lasting credit, did not pretend. She said, "Because I am going to marry him this year, and I have carried this house and that man's grief upon my back 3 winters, and I am not going to be quietly set aside at the very end of it by a copyist in a turned gown who came up the hill in October and gave him back a bird." Marian said, "He has asked me for nothing, my lady." And Lady Clarissa said, "No, he asks no living creature for anything. He stands at the edge of every room and waits for another to go first. It is the whole of his character. And if we all wait for that man to speak, we shall every one of us be 3 winters dead first. Somebody must live his life for him, and I have done it 3 years, and you have been here 6 weeks. And she was, in every hard particular, very nearly wholly right, and Marian knew it, and could not for the life of her find it in herself to hate the woman. She said only, "My lady, there is a thing owing in this house that has nothing to do with his Grace's heart, and nothing to do with any parlor in the West, and it is the music. Her Grace's own instrument locked 3 years, and her own hand stopped at 4 bars and a whole wing shut on the dark. And I will not walk away from a thing half finished that I have carried this far. My father bred it out of me. When the music of this house is let up out of the dark again, and not before, I will go where I am bid and trouble nobody." And Lady Clarissa looked at her a long, level moment, with no plan yet in her head, only the first cold shape of one setting, and said, "Quietly, that is not the whole of why you are staying. and we both of us know that it is not." And she went out and shut the door softly, and Marian stood in the cold library with a feeling like a shadow going over the sun and no notion what to do about it. Now there were two things Marian did in those weeks that were as innocent as bread and that looked held up afterward in a wicked order, as black as soot. To answer the bird, she had needed the Duchess's 4 written bars. And so, with old Peck's leave freely given, she had taken the dead lady's very manuscript up to her room of an evening to study it, and had been seen carrying it. And to be sure of the whole air, she had gone once and again, late, when the house was aibed, along the cold gallery past the forbidden wing to old Peck's warm room off the stable court, where he kept a little old harpsichord and had picked out the answering strains soft upon his keys while the deaf old man nodded by his fire. And there was nothing in either errand that was not clean and open and known to the one old servant it concerned. But it meant that a penniless girl was seen going along the dark gallery toward the burnt wing late at night, and carrying a dead Duchess's music up to her room, and letting herself into a shut man's chamber by a light nobody else carried. And those are a set of true things, every one of them true, and you may see already, held up in the wrong order by a hand that wants them wicked, exactly the black shape they can be made to take. The nail she wanted to hang it on came to Lady Clarissa the way such nails always come, from an honest neighbor who meant no harm on earth. There was a gentleman of the county, Sir Gideon Frost, a magistrate and a churchwarden of 40 years, a heavy, careful, upright man much concerned for the good order of the parish, who drove over one dark afternoon in the 2nd week of December on the business of the memorial the family meant at last to raise. And going home along the top of the down in the early dark, he saw a light in old Peck's window by the stable court, and, passing near, saw at it the Duke's music girl, and stooped and close beside her, the shape of a man. And he thought nothing whatever of it, for it was plainly only old Peck about his birds. But he mentioned it that same evening to Lady Clarissa over the tea-things at his own fireside, as a man will always tell a beautiful woman the small doings of his day. A girl. A man. A late light. It took Lady Clarissa about 4 seconds. And here is the thing that must be understood, or she is only a villain, and she was a great deal worse and truer than a villain. She was a person. She did not invent a single lie. She was shown a door out of 3 winters of holding still, and every plank of that door was made of a true thing, and she had only to gather up the true things lying ready. The girl carrying the dead Duchess's music up to her room, the girl going along the forbidden gallery by night, the girl at a lit window in the small hours with a man beside her, the dead lady's very bird somehow charmed to sing for her, the shut Duke gone strange and thawed after 3 years of stone, and hold them up to the right people, in a particular order, and let the county do the rest, and the county was aching to do the rest, for a reason Marian understood only long after, which was that for 3 winters the whole neighborhood had stood in a careful ring about, a hole in the middle of a sentence, being tactful, and here at last was a thing they were allowed to be angry about aloud, and the relief of it ran through the parish like a thaw off the hills. Lady Clarissa did not go to the Duke. She went 3 days after to Sir Gideon's own wife in her own drawing room, and was very much distressed, and said she must speak it or go distracted, that the girl had grown secret and strange, that she went by night to the burnt wing where her Grace died and would tell no soul what she did there, that she had got the dead Duchess's own music and her very bird into her keeping, that she had worked a hold upon his Grace that all could see and none could name, and that she feared. Here Lady Clarissa let her eyes fill. There was money at the back of it, some design, for how did a copyist who came up in October with nothing keep herself in secret errands, And had not Sir Gideon, with his own eyes, seen her at a dark window with a man? And the good lady carried it to Sir Gideon. And Sir Gideon, an honest heavy man who had indeed seen a man at that window, felt the floor of the thing go solid under him. And it was through both parishes by the market day, and it grew as it ran, until there was a telling in which the girl had bewitched the Duke outright, and a telling in which she was got with child by the man at the window. They called her up on the 19th of December. In the small cold morning room, Mrs. Gaunt stood by the door. Sir Gideon sat square and unhappy with his hat on his knee. Lady Clarissa sat by the hearth with her hands quiet in her lap. And the Duke of Wintercombe stood at the far window with his back to the whole room, and his hands locked behind him. Nobody bid Marian sit, and Lady Clarissa laid it out, piece by true piece, gently, grievingly, so very sorry, the girl going by night to the wing where her grace burned, the man seen with her by Sir Gideon's own eyes, the dead Duchess's music and bird got into her hands, the strange hold she had won over his grace. The money there must somewhere be at the back of it. And she said every word low and even with true tears in her eyes, and she was believed, because she more than half believed the shape of it herself, which is the way the very best lies are always told. And then she said, and I am so sorry, but it must be asked plainly, who was the man at the window? And every head turned to Marian Ashe, and Marian said, in the flat plain voice, the man at the window was Ambrose Peck, who has kept the birds and copied the music of this house 50 years, and taught her grace her first note. And I went to his room by night, because his old harpsichord is the one instrument in this house I am let touch. And I went to be sure of the notes of a tune, before I gave it to a grieving bird. And you have only to send and wake him and ask him, and he will tell you the same before God. And she turned to the room and told the whole of it, plainly, in its own slow, honest shape, the bird that sang but the half of its air and stopped, the 4 bars in her grace's own hand she had studied and no more, the tune she had built and gone to an old man's keys to be sure of, the leave freely given, and she watched it land and be too slow, and have too many parts, and ask the 4 people in it to fit a dozen quiet true things patiently together, and she saw them not do it. Because a truth in its right shape is a slow and jointed and patient thing, and asks a great deal of the hearer, and a lie is a single piece already cut to the shape of the nail, and goes in at one blow. And she turned, at the last, to the straight black back of the man at the window, and she said, only to him, and lo, sir, I have never in 7 weeks said one word to any living soul of your grief, or your wife, or the thing you told me in the library, and I never would. And you above every creature in this house know it, for you said it to me yourself by her instrument in the sleet, and there was no third thing by to hear it but the dark. And the Duke of Wintercombe, who had heard every syllable, who knew in the one deep place where a man keeps the few things he is entirely sure of, that this girl had never once betrayed him, and never could, who had in the whole of that morning one thing on earth to do, which was to turn round from the window and open his mouth, did not turn round. For to clear her he must speak, and to speak was to say the fire, and the locked key, and the forbidden room, and his wife gone down in the dark after the music he took from her, aloud before a magistrate, and the very instant any of it was said the county would have from his own mouth the proof it hungered for, that there was a terrible, unspeakable matter at the back of the young Duchess's death, and the lie would be made true in its every particular in the same breath he rose to deny it, and a man who has not said one true word aloud in 3 winters does not, at the single moment it would cost him everything to say it, become on the instant a man who can. He stood at the window with his hands locked behind his back, and the gray December light on the frost below. And he said nothing at all, and Mrs. Gaunt told Marian, in the silence, that she would leave in the morning. Now, if you would know how a music master's daughter came up out of that cold morning room, and how a man who had not said one true thing in 3 winters came at the last to stand up in the candlelight before his whole county and finish a dead woman's tune aloud, then stay by me a little longer, for I am nowhere near done with these people. And if this shut gray house has got its cold hand on you the way it had its hand on me the whole while I have been setting it down, then put your name to us before you go on, so that I may find you again tomorrow evening. For there is a great deal more of winter calm than one night will hold, and I should not like you turned away from the door of it in the dark. She was up at the cages before light the next morning, in the cold, giving the bird his answer one last time, so that he should not that very day fall back to the bars and the waiting. And old Ambrose Peck came shuffling along the dark gallery and stood by her, and said the one thing he ever said to her about the whole of it. "I could have cleared you, miss," he said in his flat, too loud voice. "I had but to go into that room and say it was my window, and my keys, and my leave, and that I have served this house 50 year, and taught her grace her first note. And there is not a soul in this county would have called old Peck a liar to his face, and they would have had to hear me. And I did not go in. I stood in the passage, and I heard them put you out, and I did not go in. For I have been afeard of that man's grief 3 winters the way you are afeard of a live thing in the dark, and I am ashamed to the very bone of me." And Marian said, "It was not yours to tell, Ambrose," and he said, "No, but it wanted telling. And I held my tongue, the same as him, the same as the whole shut lot of us." She left at 8 in the morning on the 20th of December. Mrs. Gaunt gave her a shilling that was not owed and did not meet her eye. She did not go far, for she had nowhere far to go. The sexton's widow at the foot of the down took her in for 9 pence a week, 2 miles off, and there Marian sat among strangers in a strange cold cottage, and could not for some days think of one thing in the world to do next. And she was 24, and had a shilling and 3 pounds, and her father's book, and no place under heaven. And she had gone in the plainest reckoning all the way round to exactly where the carrier set her down in October, only more alone, for in October she had not yet had a single thing to lose. And up at the great house she heard, the little bird had turned back to the bars, and would not take his answer from any other throat, and had gone in 3 days to singing the half and stopping, and waiting, as he had done 3 winters, for the one voice that was 2 miles down the hill in a widow's cottage and forbidden the gate. The county fixed on Christmas Eve for the setting of the memorial. It had been 3 years coming, the plain gray tablet the Duke had at last let them raise to his wife in the little down church, and the whole neighborhood meant to be there for the hallowing of it. 300 and 400 souls, partly for the poor young Duchess's sake, and partly, if they were honest, to see whether the disgraced music girl would have the face to show, and there was to be. The sexton's widow told Marian over the fire, no music at it, not a note. By the Duke's own particular order, a memorial in a singing church with the choir stood silent, for his grace would not have music, and never had these 3 years. And it was thought a hard, cold way to lay a woman who had sung like the angels. But there, that was Wintercombe, and who should say? And Marian Ashe sat by the borrowed fire and thought of the little bird up on the hill singing the half of a tune to a shut door, and thought of her father, and on the morning of Christmas Eve she got up and put on her gray cloak, and walked the 2 cold miles back up the down. Not to the house, she would never have dared the house, but to the church, because the whole county would be there, and one more plain woman at the back of a crowd is nobody at all, and because she could no more keep away from the end of it than she had been able, that first October dusk, to keep away from the sound of the bird. The little down church was full to the door and cold, the whole of 2 parishes packed into it in the short gray light of Christmas Eve, the silent choir in their places, the veiled gray tablet on the chancel wall, the Duke of Wintercombe standing tall and black and shut in the family pew, and Marion at the very back by the font in her gray cloak. And the rector had got no further than the first prayer of the hallowing when Sir Gideon Frost rose in his place. He was a churchwarden of 40 years and believed, wholly and honestly, that he did his plain and painful duty, and could not stand at the blessing of that poor lady's stone with the thing unsaid a moment more. And he said it out to the whole cold church in a clear country voice, that he could not in conscience see the stone set, while there stood among them the young woman who had wormed her way into his Grace's grief, who went by night to the very room where her Grace had burned, who had got the dead Duchess's music and her very bird into her keeping, and had been seen by his own 2 eyes at a dark window with a man, and 300 faces turned and found Marion Ashe at the back by the font, and it went very quiet, and the rector, half in dread and half in pity, said, "Miss Ashe, will you answer it?" And she came up through the church, for they made a lane for her the way a crowd will, and stood at the chancel step below the veiled stone with the whole county at her back. And she did not cry out that it was false, and that was the thing, for they were braced every one of them for the noise of a girl screaming no. And she did not make it, she said, in the flat plain voice she had found in front of no one and everyone. The man at the window was Ambrose Peck, who has stood there by the door this minute with 50 years of this house's service on him. And I went to his room by night because his old harpsichord is the one instrument in that great silent house I was let touch, and I went to be sure of a tune before I gave it to a grieving bird. And the music I carried was her Grace's own, 4 bars in her own hand that she left unfinished on her desk the night she died. And I studied them to learn the end of the air she was teaching her bird when she was taken. And there's the whole of my scheme and my witchcraft, that I taught a dead lady's bird the ending she died going down in the dark to fetch him. And if that is a sin, I will answer for it, but I will not have it called by a blacker name, for it is only music, let up at last out of a house that has kept it locked in the dark 3 winters, the same as it has kept everything else, the wing and the pianoforte, and her very name, and its own grief. And if you would see where the grief of this house has gone to live while it was forbidden, look no further than one small bird that has carried the whole of it none of you would pick up. And that was when the Duke of Wintercombe came out of his pew. He came down through the church, and the county drew back from him with a sound like a wave-off shingle, and he was 34 years old, and had not said a sentence of any weight to a living soul in 3 winters. And when his voice came, it was so low that the men at the back leaned in and held their breath to catch it. "Her name was Cecily," he said. He said it, and the whole church flinched as though he had fired a gun under the roof. He said, "Her name was Cecily, and she was my wife, and she is not the poor young Duchess, and she is not a hole in the middle of your kind sentences. She is dead. And she died in a fire in my house 3 winters since, and I have not been able to say her name aloud in all that time, nor let one of you say it either. And I will tell you now the thing I have never said. And then it can never again be held over this girl, nor any other soul. My wife was dying of a decline, and the physicians told me her music was bleeding the life from her, and I believed them. And I had her instrument locked and her music room shut, and I forbade her the one thing that was the whole of her, to keep her the longer. And we parted on hard words over it, the only hard words of our marriage. And in the December dark she rose and lit a candle and went in secret to that shut cold room, not to defy me, only to work out at her own keys the ending of a little air she was teaching her bird, so that a piece of her music should outlive her. And the room took fire, and she died going down alone in the dark after the very thing I had taken from her. And the last word I ever gave her living was no. And that is the thing I could not say. For there is no way to stand up in the daylight and be the Duke of Wintercombe and say that my care killed my wife and my hand shut the music out of this house the night she burned. And so I said nothing, 3 years, and made the whole house as silent and as burnt as that room, and let this girl, who never once betrayed a word I gave her, be broken before you all for a truth she never spoke. And I will not have it, and so I have spoken it myself, and it is done. And into the silence over that cold church there came, from back by the door, a small, clear, rising thread of sound, 6 notes climbing and 4 turning, and the little phrase that reached and asked. For old Ambrose Peck had carried the bullfinch down the hill under his coat and set it now upon the font. And the bird, hearing at last in that hush the voice of the man who had loved its mistress, threw up its blunt black head and sang the first strain, the whole climbing question of it, and stopped, and waited, in front of 300 souls, for the answer. And the Duke of Wintercombe turned toward the little bird on the font, and did the thing he had not done in 3 winters. He lifted his head, and he sang, low and rough and unpracticed and true, the falling answering strain, his wife's own ending that a music master's girl had built up out of 4 burnt bars and given back to the world. And the little rose-breasted bird took it, and answered him, and sang the whole air through, first strain and answer, entire, the way its lost mistress had meant it sung before she died, going down in the dark to finish it. And the sound of that small whole music going up in the cold packed church on Christmas Eve broke 3 winters of silence like ice going off a river, and there was not a dry face in the whole of it, from the family pew to the poorest cottager at the door. And then Lady Clarissa Vaux stood up, white to the lips, and said, she never said one word of it. I took true things and set them in a wicked order and carried them to Sir Gideon's house myself. Because this girl came up the hill in October with nothing, and undid in 7 weeks a thing I had waited 10 years for, and there was nothing in it I could fight. For she only was not afraid of him, and I made a lie out of true pieces because I could not bear it, and it is mine, the whole of it. And then she looked at the Duke and said, and you never once said no to me either. In 10 years, not once. I would have taken a no long ago and gone and had a life of my own. But you let me wait at your gate the same as you have made every creature here wait at yours, and I am done waiting now. And I wish you both well, and I am ashamed, and I am going. And she walked out through the lane in the crowd into the gray Christmas light alone, and no one stopped her. And that was the last morning she was ever seen in that parish. What the Duke did after, he did quietly, and without his name on it. He had the burnt wing rebuilt, and the music room thrown open, the great pianoforte unlocked, the chapel choir called back, and he endowed a singing school for the poor children of both parishes and a new organ for the down church, so that no house near him should ever again be shut and silent in its grief the way his had been. Lady Clarissa married, the spring following, a member of Parliament in the West, and she and Marion never met nor wrote again. But when the first Wintercombe child was born there, came a parcel from the West with no letter in it, only that length of good dark stuff made up at last into a warm shawl. And Marion wore it winters, and could never bring herself to think ill of the woman. They were married in the little down church at Candlemas, and the whole county came, and old Ambrose Peck gave out the psalm in his cracked, deaf voice a full bar ahead of the choir, and nobody minded. And the bullfinch sang his whole air from a cage by the font, question and answer all through. And there is one thing more, and then I will let you go. On the desk in the new music room there hangs, framed under glass, the sheet where a dying woman began, on the last night of her life, to write out for her bird the ending of an old air, and got down 4 bars and no more, and below the 4 bars, in another and a rougher hand, the rest of the answering strain is written out whole and finished. For the Duke sat down one evening in the second winter of his new marriage, and completed in ink the tune his wife died going down to finish, and had the 2 hands framed together, because it was true, and there was no longer any reason on earth it could not be said. So here is where I leave you. On a cold, bright Christmas morning in a packed country church with 300 people weeping and a small bird singing a whole song at last. I have thought all this week of old Ambrose Peck, who kept the truth in his chest 3 winters because he was afraid of a man that never once raised his voice, and of the 2 ways there are of carrying a grief too heavy to say, you may do as the Duke did, and lay it silently on the shoulders of everyone who loves you, and call the weight of it respect. Or you may be the one who stands up at the last in the cold and sings the true ending aloud. Tell me, before you sleep tonight, which of the 2 you have lately been. And if there is a music in your own house that has been locked in the dark a long while, you might think this week on whether it is not time the key was turned. Next time I mean to tell you what became of the little bird, and of the singing school on the down, and of the soldier brother who came home the spring after to a house he left silent and found full of music. And if you have come all this cold way up the down with us to the end of it, put in the comments below which city you are watching from, for I read every one, and it never ceases to astonish me how far the sound of a small song carries in the dark.